therefore, because of their form, children, African people, really, just sound the truth. Where's textual or archaeological connective tissue between the two? The short answer is that there isn't much. I have any. Archaeological evidence for child sacrifice. Eastern Mediterranean is including nation. Bordering on economic. There were some find sites like Gezer and Tanakh, but first they were thought to reveal this of sacrifices like that, which showed that probably were. Egyptian nations of Egypt, like children being thrown from walls or sacrificed, they were often associated with child sacrifices. Maybe, but exactly how to understand those. Now, as I mentioned, while we show extensive evidence of all the sacrifice, interestingly, the evidence there is surprisingly severe. No human-like topaz have yet been found. Like, it might just be fake. The descriptions that clearly dear Allah and others are all fragment. Unlike plethora of punic inscriptions, sacrifices, and Carthaginian, in fact, the strata of the punics have far more land ratio all by the end practice with Romans invaded African territory. And all that, there were 20% more baby lambs being nearly totally replaced after the Roman conquest. But while the connection between language and vowel-based generation of children of punic sites is frankly very similar to the ceremonies described in the Bible, we gotta be honest. That connection, if there is one, and I certainly think there is one, the connection remains pretty unknown textually and archaeologically. It's far more circumstantial than not. Now, despite this, I and many other scholars do think the evidence is strong enough to conclude there was no deity Molech or Moloch to whom babies were sacrificed. Speaking of the text, rather, I tend to agree with the position that Molech was, in fact, a kind of child sacrifice imported into Judaism from nation ceremonial practice. So, as we see, Molech sacrifice, that child sacrifice, was just one of at least 3 other forms of Judaism child sacrifice. So just because a Molech probably is a sacrifice, probably of an origin, Israelites too. Zeroing in on the Hebrew Bible as a source for learning more about sacrifices just a loose one. It's mentioned in the time, most of the time, ritual past children, male to female children, to a fire, otherwise burning place as a tofu. Otherwise mysterious word, by the way, which means might come from the Arabic word for heart, but scholars still debate what a tofu is. So the localization of both Molech and Tophet have actually been the result of taboo immigration or exchange, much like they are in worship. Now, the ritual was first associated in the Judaic as actually different types of in the north, especially modeling furniture and fabric. It's asked and in this region that he would brought ceremony down to Judea. It was continued by Manasseh before the Tophet was destroyed of Josiah. Interestingly enough, by the way, the otherwise righteous King Hezekiah and his prophet everyone loves, were right in the historical center of the practice. It seemed to have been going on right there during while they were alive. In fact, Isaiah 30 even imagines Syria itself as being sacrificed at Jerusalem Tophet as a Molech sacrifice. So, did Isaiah it? Also invites an actual question. The Molech sacrifice wasn't made to a deity of Molech or Moloch. Then probably Yahweh, as shocking as that might seem to some of y'all out there. Though, as we'll see, the sacrifice of children to Yahweh was anything other than new at this point. Thus, it appears that the ritual was centered around sacrificing children upon the divine fulfillment of the vow, prayer, or an oath by, well, burning them. Now, we don't know if they were alive while they were being burned, or were killed prior to that and then burned. Not clear. Most sacrifices were actually killed first, then burned, but not any better either way. Judean Yahwism by Ahaz or a couple of ended by Josiah. However, from Judean Yahwism into the future specifically by the only form of child sacrifice found in ancient Israel. Right. These two other forms of child sacrifice Bible in a very complex narrative. 3, we find the Moabite king, the Moabites similar, the Moabite king Misha route led by an alliance of Israelite, Judahite, and Edomite kings. He's ultimately besieged at his fortress at Peter Harisset, following up prophetically or reversal. Well, Misha sacrificed his firstborn son as an olah, or burnt offering, on the walls of that. Significant enough, this does successfully bring down divine wrath. From the Moabite national god Chemosh, the triple alliance of the Israelites, Judah, Edomites, who promptly end the siege and retreat to get right out of there because Chemosh is attacking the family. Now, there is a lot to unpack in this tale, but what we apparently have is a narrative where a Moabite king sacrifices his firstborn son, which invokes the wrath of a non-Yahweh god, Chemosh. Yahweh has much power territory because forever got the time were geographically bound and divine king or region, as it were, to bring down the sacrifice, bring down wrath upon the Edomites and their Yahweh's allies. Now, we've already seen potential Egyptian depictions of child sacrifice upon the walls where they burned out child population like siege to some Canaanite cities. That was associated again with Iran and Island region. So the idea of sacrificing children walls of the cities kind of, and here we have a narrative revival where child sacrifice is shockingly effective at covering divine action. And point to other references in classical literature where we have similar accounts of child sacrifice occurring siege to which is true in a context as well. However, Misha's sacrifice is logically different than a Lamolech sacrifice. In a Lamolech sacrifice, one makes a vow and God satisfies that vow, and then the sacrifice is made. Here it seems that King Misha to induce divine action. Now, that's a risky bargain, but it seems to have worked out, and it's clearly born out of Christ. In some ways, the kind of crisis to human sacrifice, Christ's child sacrifice. In the same vein of the Lamolech sacrifice, the tale of Jephthah at Judges chapter 11. In that narrative, Jephthah wishes for military success, vows to Yahweh that given such success, he'll sacrifice whatever comes out his door first. Well, successfully defeats Ammonite, and of course his daughter bursts out the door celebrating her father's victory in song. After a short period of reprieve, Jephthah, he'll kind of sacrifices his daughter to Yahweh. While this narrative does have some folkloric elements, especially the element of ironic reversal, it certainly contains the notion of a vow sacrifice, similar to those over there in Punic Heartland. Probably the Lamolech sacrifices are condemned. And such sacrifices, of course, we see here they can be rendered to Yahweh. Indeed, Micah chapter 6 also at least entertains the idea that sacrificing one's firstborn for the remission of one's sins as kind of ultimate sacrifice. It's more valuable, we learn, than thousands of rams or 10,000 rivers of oil. It was at least imaginable in the minds of Israelite prophet, even if it were ultimately rejected by Yahweh via that prophet. That in contradistinction to what we'll see in prophetic child condemnation sacrifices by later prophets. So come back to that. Also, keep the idea in mind that a sacrifice of a firstborn child might have the effect of allowing for forgiveness of sins. That just matter. Finally, at the rather archaic legal section at Exodus 22, around 28 or 28, 29, Yahweh demands that, like various animals, firstborn male children are also to be given over to Yahweh, taken from their mother after days in Yahweh, thus apparently establishing a general requirement of child sacrifice. Boys. Of course, such a generalized demand of child sacrifice is utterly unimaginable to us given how we relate to children in a contemporary context. However, that's not their context. Given an Iron Age infertility rate of around 50%, and that women had far more children than now, assuming those having children didn't kill those women, the idea of sacrificing the first child you give to ensure for healthy children in the future, that's perfectly reasonable. Indeed, the very logic of all sacrifices in the Bible in some sense. First fruits of your stock, of your life way, so that you get abundant. It's a gruesome logic, but it's further this idea of having to be Yahweh the firstborn justifies the Passover event in which Yahweh had death go through and kill the firstborn of all the Egyptian children. Thus, it's kind of an eternal trade of the sort. The Israelite liberation on the back of the killing of one generation of Egyptian children, itself, by the way, a kind of mass child sacrifice, for being honest, such that Israelite firstborn boys or parents would forever bear the cult. Now, that custom is still kept alive in Judaism with the fast of firstborn boys on the eve of Passover. You don't kill them. You're going to be hungry before they eat matzah. Such a custom of child sacrifice is widespread among the Gauls. Frankly, that's impossible to know. There's a bit of archaeological evidence of it, but it occurs on at least a few grounds. The first Hebrew Bible itself, especially in later legal sections, is aware of this requirement for child sacrifice in various kinds of escape. Away from those in the form of sacrifices of children, something, by the way, that we also for Punic Tophet in North Africa. Specific groups have to serve as Levite. They have to go there. Sometimes just a cash payment to get you out of being sacrificed. Perhaps eventually some of this work or that 8-day clause, and eventually fasting and other ritual substitutions as well. Some of those substitutions are still per Jewish law or halakha. Always fasting, firstborn fasting on the eve of Passover, but the pledge of firstborns to Yahweh service is also substituted by the ritual of Pidyon Haben. Now, I'll be honest, it's personally my favorite of all Haben, but here is Prince member of the Israel priesthood returns the boy, thank God, to parents for a ritual payment of shekel, or between 90 grams silver, just under $100, 2024. Great for silver. There should be such an exchange rate called gold, but not bad. Of course, some of the evidence that child sacrifice to Yahweh did occur in ancient Israel is that the Hebrew Bible is at least. This very usually implies but on what grounds child sacrifice forbidden? Well, not so much because sacrificing children is immoral, because the practice is it's a non-Israelite way of worshiping Yahweh, and those passages anachronistically assigns that kind of moral child sacrifice to Canaanites. However, there is some, as we on his origin of the sacrifice concerned. The ancient Israelites practiced some forms of child sacrifice, funeral sacrifice, vow or their sacrifice of animals, and that ritual crisis sacrifice. Along with those, Cheska Sapra Kapulu also for sacrifice shady entities, perhaps Shaddai gods. Actually, on 106 and her Allah is so those well and for accomplishment worth past fellowship. It appears that following the reforms of Sinai instruction, temple Israelite child sacrifice come to an end. So much so that by the time of the prophets of that period, of the temple, the exile, it had become memory. Ezekiel's children were sacrificed to the Elohim, idols, but actually they related to the word for feces. So that's colorful. I can expect that kind of stuff. I didn't think that. Could God? It's a Ezekiel 20 even goes so far as to assert that Yahweh had actually pious, rebellious Israelites to sacrifice their children, but not just their Yahweh, but as punishment. Still suggests Yahweh gave the Israelites actions that weren't good, purpose to decimate them, such that Yahweh child sacrifice simply to torture the rebellious Israelites. But you can always rely on his guilt, all the way up. Anyone else need a drink yet? Time. Jeremiah takes a similar track, but argues that the Israelites committed child sacrifices to Baal rather than Yahweh. Again, the problem here is proper target rather than killing children for gods. In fact, Jeremiah goes so far as to claim that Yahweh claimed that he didn't even command such a the first fact he never thought of it. The idea never arose in my heart, in my mind. Yahweh. By Jeremiah, and probably quite some time after, child sacrifice had long come to an end. Yahweh is fully exculpated from the whole horrible business by both prophetic declarations and all these legal substitution escape clauses in the final redaction of the legal code. All in all, it's a careful cleanup operation. And the most typically enduring account of the Bible. There, the language of Isaac being yechid or unique only, despite the fact that he has another Ishmael, he is there, and we've already seen the language employed in the wider Semitic context of child sacrifice. This, by the way, is perhaps being informed. Tales being informed by the technical language of child sacrifice, which tells us that they knew something about another. Now, I imagine we tale of the of Isaac. Abraham takes like a mountain, sacrifice him. He always said so. Raises the knife, he'll intervene. There in the thicket, logical sacrifice. Conclusion, like not have him. Given gorgeous stars, seashores, and all the nations are blessing him forever and ever. Something strange happened. Abraham alone is noted on the mountain. There ain't no mention of Isaac. Many scholars, both secular and religious, have noticed this very odd element of the tale and have made obvious conclusions. We're probably looking at what is earlier in the story in which Isaac was actually sacrificed, with the whole angelic intervention and animal substitution of the later theological sanitized version interpolated to story. Even many Jewish religious commentators conclude that something similar had to have occurred, with the story ultimately taking on radical elements of Kabbalistic speculation. I want to get more into the idea that Isaac really sacrificed, and a version of that, you got to check out Levinson's classic of the beloved son. Now, I said that Israelite child sacrifice came to an end with the reforms of Josiah and the Bible exile. That seems true. It seems aside from the most important act of child sacrifice in all of Israelite history. Recall that from the prophet Micah, Micah chapter 6, was made and rejected that firstborn child sacrifice could act for the remission of sin. Yes, child sacrifice for the remission of sins was rejected, such that one should simply, beautiful, of course, only do justice and to love good for God. But simple enough, Micah has no way to teach us that we don't need elaborate sacrifices, much less child sacrifices, to get more forgiveness of our sins. Please be sorry, repent, be a pious good person. That's enough for the prophet Micah, until it wasn't. Theology of Jesus' and for the pervasive sins brought upon human beings by Adam revived Israelite child sacrifice over against the pronouncement of Yahweh via the prophet Micah. Here, the suffering and execution of Jesus via crucifixion as an active divine child sacrifice of the firstborn son acts as the final conclusive atonement to human beings from their eternal damnation. Adam, Jesus is both the high priest holding the knife and the lamb to be slaughtered. Thus, Israelite child sacrifice emerged from centuries of obscurity and theological horror to become the central theological mechanism of salvation of the world's largest religion, proudly on vivid display in churches the world over. Israelite child sacrifice, ancient Yahwistic practice, foundly condemned as horrid by later prophets and legalists, would ultimately emerge logically triumphant as Christianity. The best volume on the topic, Israel's child sacrifice in Israel, and I think it makes great points in the volume, but it also reading along with just Manasseh sacrifice, the portion of realities, heard incredibly fascinating arguments about the child sacrifices to which he Shaddai gods, or perhaps there. But until next time, hopefully something more cheery. Dr. Justice Lynch, for watching Terra, where we explore the arcane history.
seatbelt art coming in soon, and Kill Tony stickers come with a lot of the purchases. I personally love the Kill Tony NASCAR shirt, Kill Tony established 2013 along this super cool stuff. We test all of this out ourselves and make sure that it's very high quality. A cool KT tag on it with a knife and the logo on everything. Anyway, merch.com, you know what to do. Support the show, buy some stuff, look cool, tell your friends. You know what to do. Tony brought you by the Red Rose for us, security guard service and Screwball peanut butter whiskey. How about a handful of fun? All right.